Chapter 28, Section 2, Forming an Uneasy Peace. During the war, the United States and the USSR formed an alliance based on mutual interest. Although they had differences, the two nations set these aside to focus on the shared goal of defeating Germany. The differences resurfaced, however, as the war ended, and the Allies began to plan for the post-war era. A wartime alliance begins to erode. In February 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill met in the Soviet city of Yalta for the Yalta Conference. In mostly amicable talks, they agreed to collaborate in shaping post-war Europe. They decided to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones, each controlled by a different Allied country. They also declared their support for self-government and free elections in Eastern Europe. Roosevelt returned from Yalta with hope that the wartime Allies could maintain friendly relations. Soon, however, that relationship began to weaken. In July, with Germany defeated, the Allied leaders met again in Potsdam near Berlin. Harry S. Truman now represented the United States, having become president after FDR's death 3 months earlier. Churchill, later replaced by new Prime Minister Clement Attlee, and Stalin also attended. At the Potsdam Conference, the Allies finalized their post-war plans for Germany, including the division of Berlin into occupation zones. The mood at Potsdam was tense. During the conference, Truman learned that the United States had tested its first atomic bomb. He hinted to Stalin that the United States had a powerful new weapon, but he did not name it. This fueled Stalin's distrust of the United States. Truman also felt wary of Stalin. The Soviet army still occupied much of Eastern Europe, and Truman was suspicious of Soviet intentions. The Soviet leader had promised to allow free elections in Eastern Europe, but had not yet fulfilled that promise. In fact, in Poland, the Soviets had helped rig elections to ensure a communist win. Truman and Stalin clearly held very different visions of post-war Europe. Security concerns drove many of Stalin's decisions. Germany had attacked the Soviet Union in 2 world wars, using Poland as its invasion route. Stalin wanted to create a buffer zone of friendly communist states to protect the USSR. Viewing control of Eastern Europe as critical to his nation's security, he claimed the region as a Soviet sphere of influence. Truman, on the other hand, wanted to allow Eastern European nations to determine their own form of government. He believed that given free choice, they would pick democracy. The US and USSR count up the costs of war. The United States and the USSR viewed Europe's future differently, in part because of their very different experiences in World War II. The USSR had suffered enormous casualties. As many as 20 million Soviet citizens died in the war, including at least 7 million soldiers. Many were killed or died of disease in German labor camps. Others starved when Nazi invasion forces stripped the Soviet countryside of crops, farm animals, and equipment, and torched farms and villages. In addition, the Nazis leveled several Soviet cities, including Stalingrad and Kiev. Flying into the USSR in 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower noted, "I did not see a house standing between the western borders of the country and Moscow." In contrast, the United States suffered far less from the war. Approximately 290,000 U.S. soldiers had died, but civilian casualties were limited to those killed or wounded at Pearl Harbor. Other than that attack, no fighting took place on U.S. soil, no cities were bombed, and no farms or factories were destroyed. In fact, the U.S. economy boomed during the war. By 1945, the United States was producing more than half of the world's total industrial output. The United States had spent at least $320 billion financing the war, but most Americans felt the money was well spent. President Truman called it an investment in world freedom and world peace. Like the rest of Europe, the Soviet Union hoped for aid to rebuild after the war. It asked the United States for a loan, but Truman, angered by Stalin's broken promises and disregard of the Yalta agreements, decided on a get-tough policy toward the Soviets. Shortly after Germany fell, Truman stopped all Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union. Even American ships already traveling to the Soviet Union returned home. Stalin called this action brutal. Differing ideologies shaped the US and the USSR. The differences between the United States and the Soviet Union resulted from more than just wartime experiences. They also represented sharp differences in ideology, or the set of beliefs that formed the basis of a political and economic system. The U.S. system centered on a belief in democratic government and capitalist economics. make most of the economic decisions. Business owners decide what to produce, and consumers decide what to buy. Most property, factories, and equipment are privately owned. The United States hoped to see capitalist democracy spread throughout Europe. The USSR also hoped European countries would accept its system, which was communism. Communists regard capitalism as an unjust system that produces great social inequalities and denies the proletariat, or working class, a fair share of society's wealth. Communism revolves around single-party rule of politics and government control of the economy. The state owns and runs most businesses and decides what goods will be produced. Such a system is also known as a command or centrally planned economy. In this type of system, small farms are often joined together in collectives, which the state and the farmers own together.